Hey everybody, this is Seth Haynes from musiciansguide to hustling.com. Back today with another interview with Charlie McCarron. Charlie is a composer, a podcaster, all kinds of stuff. Charlie, first off, thanks so much for taking the time to come on. Can you just give us a little background about yourself, what it is you do, and just tell us a little bit about your career?
Sure. First, thanks, Seth, for having me on. Appreciate it. Yeah, my background, I'm a video producer and a composer, and my composing has recently, I went to school for composition, but I kind of took a break after college from serious composing, and kind of just did a lot of songwriting. Um, but about 4 years ago, I had the drive to get back into doing more with my composing and actually use my degree.
Sure.
So
What an idea.
yeah. So I started with the concept of trying to write 45 minutes of music every month. And that turned out to be just a huge, huge mark that I didn't hit. But in the meantime, I was interviewing some friends with the goal of doing a podcast, and that
Okay.
ended up being actually really more fun for me at the time than even making music because it was a new thing to do. And so I started this podcast, Composer Quest, and I'm now in my fourth year, and yeah,
Very cool.
it's been a ton of fun. So yeah, that's the short story. But right now I compose for different things, for films, for video games, a little bit of commercial work, and yeah, and for myself sometimes. And
Yeah, absolutely. So I would love to kind of just start this off with some of your composition work you're currently doing because um, I think that I mean, you do the type of work where I think a lot of people think like oh my god, I would love to write video game music. Like I would love to do like do like film scoring or whatever it might be, or like I wish I could get like that kind of I wish I could get some commercial work that like to like pay the bills and everything like while writing music. So can you just talk a little bit about like how do you so we can talk specifics about some of the specific projects you've done in just a minute, but so actually, how do you get like what was the first step you took to like kind of start getting your foot in the door and working in these various spaces of writing music in like this way?
sure, I think like the major turning point to all of my almost all of the connections I've made is a friend I met while working at the cable access station in Stillwater. Was a video producer, Jason Schumacher, and he kind of saw one of my projects that I had done in college. It was like a grand scope concept album, triple album thing, and
Okay.
he saw that and or he heard that and liked what I was doing with sound design, and so then he hired me to mix the sound for his feature film. And I didn't really know what I was doing, so I was like, I don't know, $10 an hour, which is ridiculously cheap for audio
Right.
mixing. But it was a great experience, and then Jason and I became good friends, and he ended up like he's very connected in the film scene, so that's helped me get a lot of gigs with filmmakers and commercial producers, that kind of thing. Um, so I think like the main thing to think about with your first step is like first create something, uh, or I'm speaking from a composer perspective,
Yeah, please, of course.
but yeah, I mean creating a work of art uh, that you're just like passionate about yourself. You might not think it's like the you might think first you have to seek out people who seek out like video producers or whatever gig you want to get, like apply for it like a job. But really, it's more about like developing your own art, I think, and then the people will come to you when they respect your art, and you just have more. You have a better shot of um, getting gigs and stuff if people respect your art from the start,
Right.
regardless of if it's like commercial art or something.
Yeah,
Like,
totally. I mean, and so just to kind of like dig into that a little bit. I mean, I had a very similar experience with how I got started doing like the consulting work that I do for marketing. And I think one of the most valuable things that a lot of people, you know, this my own perspective and observations, and I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on this. Is like a lot of people, I think, especially younger folks that are just getting started and thinking like, oh, I would love to do, you know, XYZ thing. And I think it's really easy to like get kind of I think it's difficult for people to like make the investment of creating something without knowing like, oh, this is going to, you know, be a thing, which if you're doing something you really, I mean, I always kind of think about if you're doing something you actually really love and you like actually really want to do it, then like the creation part should be the best part. Like that should be like that's where you're sitting down having fun, and especially if it's just for yourself at first, like and just doing something that you think is like fulfilling and engaging work for you. Like I think that's tremendously important. I mean, and it sounds like that was like a significant thing for you as well. It's just kind of having that kind of like basis of like you could show your work, like you could demonstrate what you could do by like showing them these other projects you had done. Is that
yeah,
fair assessment of that?
yeah. I'd say like my uh, sorry, I just got sidetracked in the train of thought. Um, I think uh, doing like a project that you are passionate about, like one of the main things with that is to keep in mind like maybe you don't need to um, you don't have a specific goal in mind for the project, because I think sometimes the art gets is better if you don't have the goal of like, well, I'm going to sell 1,000 CDs with this.
Right, right.
Sometimes you need that drive to keep going, but um, having no expectations for your own projects kind of helps. But then transitioning into like doing client work for people, there is that expectation, and I think it takes a little more maturity to get to that point where you're not like doing your own. You have to understand that you're kind of like subservient to the project as a whole.
Right, right. Your piece
Uh,
plays a very specific. You're one piece of a much bigger puzzle
yeah,
in that in that scenario.
yeah. And I've come to like find that as a really fun creative challenge now, like working with other people, where my music, in a way, kind of has more of a purpose than something I just create on my own. Um, but yeah, hopefully some of that made sense.
Yeah, totally. No, totally. Well, and so before we get to the client stuff, um, you know, so how did you? So you were. I'm really interested in this kind of like first initial connection because I feel like for everybody out there, I mean, I've talked to a bunch of people on this show and then just people I know and people, I mean, even clients I've worked with and like that are like, I mean, like I've done work with like, you know, people like I used to do some work for like the Canadian Brass's record label, and like I mean,
Oh,
even like people like at that like height of like their like career and their genre, their space in the music world, it seems like everybody almost has like there was like one person that really got them kind of like their first little start, and I think a lot of people tend to look at. I mean, people on my list say this all the time. They're like, "Well, I just don't know enough people," and it's I don't even know that it's necessarily. I don't really look at it from the perspective of you have to know everybody. You just have to like know like it's not it's knowing the right people. It's you that could be one person. So like in your case, how did you meet that person? Can you just dive? Can you just dig in a little
sure.
bit more to that like where that
Yeah,
came from? Because a lot of people, I think, it's not where they expect it to come from.
yeah. Well, I'll give you the example of how I got into video game scoring is one of my brother's friends. he also went to the same college as me, but he was a freshman when I was a senior, and we didn't hang out that much there. But I knew that he was into video games and like making video games, and so I remember just one time I just sent him a piece of my music that I thought sounded video gamey, and
Right.
like no expectations or anything. It was kind of a fun experiment I was doing, and I was like, hey, I know you're doing some video game stuff. And he never ended up using that, but then like 2 years later, he got back in touch with me and was like, hey, I'm actually going to be working on games now. So, what do you, yeah, what do you want to join me as like a video game startup sort of thing? So, that's been great experience. And yeah, I think for people, it's just like, there are networks for people like in the video game world. There's IGDA, which is International Game Developer Association, I think.
Okay.
And they have chapters in like almost every big city. And you go there and they have game jams. You can join in. And
What's a
and
game
what that
jam?
is, yeah, that's like people
Sounds
have
like
a
fun.
weekend. It's really fun. People have a weekend to make a game, and they kind of clump you together in teams. And like the one I went to was, they give you a name tag that says you fill out what role you want to play. So I just wrote musician, and then you find other people to work with. It's great doing something like that. And I mean, in the film world, there are I always think of the film world, at least here in the Twin Cities, as being really, it has to be connected. Like everybody has to know each other, because making a film, you need to know
Right.
you need
There's a ton
someone
of
from
people
every,
involved.
yeah, yeah. So just making that first connection sometimes could be just going to one of these meetups or gatherings of people in that community.
Now, are those like free to go to? Like, if I
Yeah.
wanted to, like, knowing absolutely nothing, if I wanted to show up there right now, could I do that and just walk in the door? Just
Oh yeah.
sign up online?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I don't think I've ever really heard of a paid meetup for those communities.
Yeah, I've never heard of a paid meetup for anything like that, like that, and like that kind of thing. But
Yeah.
yeah, so that's really interesting. I mean, and I feel like what you just said to like a lot of composers or people that do composition, whether they're like a full-time composer or trained composer or whatever, or they just like, noodle around on Sibelius or Finale for like hours every Sunday morning, just because it's fun. I feel like that's something that a lot of people wouldn't even consider at all. So like,
Yeah.
so that's great advice for anybody out there watching, listening.
Yeah.
Check these things out. So
Well, one last point on that. I
yeah,
feel
please.
like since a lot of your listeners are musicians too, I don't know. Maybe you have some advice on this, but
Sure.
I feel like there's sort of a lack in the music community, at least like, yeah, classical composer style, performer composers. There feels like a lack of meetups for that kind of group, of like meeting composers, meeting musicians, and vice versa. So yeah, I don't know if you have any advice on that.
Yeah, well, so like in your mind, like your experience and you knowing the people you have met and worked with, like what would an ideal kind of meetup thing look like? Because I mean, I would love to kind of talk to jump in on this, but before I do, what would like the ideal scenario meetup situation like? Who are the people showing up and what are they doing there?
Yeah, I have talked
If there
about
is
this
an
with some
ideal one.
people here. I don't know. We talked about like composer musician speed dating, uh, but it's kind of a tricky thing, because like um, sometimes like you want to seek out very good players, and it's harder to, you can't like just ask someone, hey, are you really a good player or something for
Right,
musicians,
right.
but sometimes it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's just like making a connection with anyone who wants to try playing your music. Um, and I guess like through my podcast, what I've tried to do is have these composing quests, which are challenges to my listeners to write a piece for a specific ensemble. So we just had like a film score collaboration thing where we paired up filmmakers and composers, and we have an orchestra that performs the scores live with the films. And that's like such a cool way to meet, for the musicians to meet the composers, composers to meet filmmakers, and that kind of thing. Um,
Wow, yeah.
so, so that, I mean, like, this is a little bit of a side tangent, but
No,
sometimes
no, please.
you just have to, what I've learned through doing the podcast and stuff is you kind of have to make your own opportunities sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, especially if you're in a smaller city or no matter where you are, really, you just have to sometimes create your own events, um, that kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. Well, what I would say, I mean, there are about a million tools people could use for this kind of thing, but the probably, I mean, like if I right now wanted to put together a meetup for something like this, I think the first and foremost thing that people have to consider, I mean, is uh, finding the right people to show up to it. And so then it's a question of, all right, well, who are these people and where do they hang out? How can I get in touch with them? So, I mean, what I would do, anybody can go to just meetup.com and create a group. And, once you have a group on meetup.com, you could very easily like just take the link to the meetup group and just pick a day, say, all right, on October 15th of this year, we're going to get together, we're going to have a bunch of composers, like this group of composers, these four people from, I don't know, my school or the faculty of this college in the region, in the area, are going to get together, and we're just going to read through music, and then see if you can't get, make it like a cover dish or something. Everybody bring your own 6-pack, whatever it is, to make it like, an event, like something for people to do. And just go around. Honestly, what I would do is I would go around on Facebook, because there are things like pretty much every city, for anybody watching or listening that is interested in this idea. If you go on Facebook and type in, I live in Philadelphia, just type in Philadelphia classical musicians, you'll find Facebook groups with classical musicians in Philadelphia. If you go to if you go to these pages and just post in there and say, "Hey guys, I'm looking to do XYZ thing." I mean, heck, record like a miniature video of yourself explaining what it is. You could do that on your, I could record that literally right now on my iPhone. Like, it would take 10 seconds to do, and post it in the group, post it in a couple of groups. If you live in somewhere, like anybody that lives in a big city, there's no excuse not to find these people, because like New York, I mean, come on, there are like probably 50 groups there's probably a group for salsa musicians, there's a group for tango musicians, there's a group for classical violinists, there's a group for people that play the marimba, probably. Like, I mean, there are so many people out there. I mean, you could very easily get together a little group and, try it out. Maybe the event is like a total bomb and it's like sucks, but at least you got it together and worked on it. But find a way to make it like fun and engaging and appealing. And if it's a way to meet people around the area, I mean, especially if you can get younger folks to show up that like maybe aren't as guarded with their time and or as busy.
Yeah.
Great. I mean, anybody could do that. Reach out to the local colleges, like the French horn teacher at the local college, and say, "Hey, we need a horn player to show up to this thing. Do you think any of your students will be interested in showing up?" That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could. I mean, it would take a little bit of time to reach out to these folks and everything, but all you need is an email script that you can just repeat over and over and over again to people. Just fill in the blank: horn, clarinet, composer, organist, whatever it is. I mean, anybody can find a church or something, or like rent out the facility at a local, like, the music school or something. Get somebody to sign out a room and, go to town. Like,
Yeah.
take a little bit of time, but I think they could totally do that. I mean, and I think to kind of wrap this back into what Charlie was saying, you need to know the people working in the space. And this is a great way to start meeting people. And even if it's like not like the big dogs in town are coming to this like free little meetup, you can meet the people that maybe work with the big dogs in town or study with them, or
Yeah.
they might be the people that are the ones doing the hiring in 3 years,
Yeah.
2 years. You never know. Um, yeah, I mean, I think the important thing with anything like this is just to just try it. Just try something. Like, I think I was talking to actually Garrett Hope, who introduced us, Charlie. I was talking to Garrett one day about something, and he was just like, yeah, the thing I always think about is that done is better than perfect. And it's so true. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and it's like, it doesn't have to be like the most amazing event ever to start out. I mean, the first time any group that you've ever heard of, the first time they played together was probably in a crappy bar somewhere, or like in their garage or their parents' basement or something. I mean, like, everybody starts somewhere.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah, and the last thing I would say, since I have to stop because I'll rant on this for like an hour, but like, but I mean, the last thing I would say is that the really valuable thing for anybody listening to this that maybe lives in, I mean, whether you live in a small city or or like a rural area, and that's maybe an hour outside of a city. I mean, one of the most valuable things you can do whenever you're meeting other people is be the person that's introducing someone to someone else. Like, if you can be kind of like the contact point where they think like, oh, I'm glad Charlie introduced me to that person, or I'm glad Charlie facilitated that event where I got to meet XYZ people. Like, then you become the connector of the people connecting with other people, which is a great place to be, because, you want to be the person that's able to like make connections for other people. That's a really valuable place to be. That's
Yeah.
why that's why the contractors in any city are the people that work the most, because everybody wants to hire the contractor because they can hire them back. They can introduce them to people. Like,
Yeah.
they have the connections.
Yeah. On that point, um, like, I would say a good point to get to with yourself and your business or whatever it is to realize, like, you don't always have to be the one to take this specific gig, because like sometimes people who are better at it than you, and
Yeah.
it's you just have to sometimes be a little selfless and realize, like, I don't have the time or the specific talents for this, so you pass it on to someone else. But that act is like sometimes almost more important than taking a gig for yourself, because you're helping someone else, and they'll probably return the favor at some point.
Absolutely. I mean, reciprocation is a powerful thing. We're like hardwired to like return the favor for things like that.
Yeah.
That's have you ever
There's some marketing techniques around that too, right?
Oh, absolutely. I've been working on I've been working on a book, and one of the things I'm talking about in the book, one of the things I talk about is like, even if you can't do, you like physically can't do the gig, like it's a lead trumpet gig with like a big band, and you like cannot play lead trumpet, then first off, never ever say yes to something you cannot do. Like, don't do that, because it's better to not be able to play than to leave a bad taste in somebody's mouth. They're like, that's a way preferable thing. But if you can hire the people that are like above you, so like if there's someone that plays in like the regional orchestra and they get called to play in like these other regional orchestras and things, or if you're a composer that gets asked to do like, oh, can you do this arranging, like some local church needs you like a custom arrangement of like a hymn for their Easter service that they can use with brass quintet and organ. Like, if you don't know anything about choir music or writing for organ or brass, like, don't take that. Pass it off to somebody else that like could maybe return the favor, like you said. I mean, I would.
But it is a balance, because like sometimes you should take gigs that stretch you out of your comfort zone.
Oh, absolutely. I completely agree with that.
Yeah, but it is a balancing thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't want to sit here and ramble this entire time. I'd much rather hear from you. People that watch or read my stuff hear from me all the time. I'd much rather hear from you, Charlie. So one of the things that to kind of get back on track here, that I would another thing that I would love to kind of hear you talk about is what we started kind of getting at a few minutes ago is whenever you're actually reaching out to um, whenever you're reaching out to to people in different spaces where that you're doing essentially client work, so like people hire you to do a job for them. Can you talk a little bit about how your own personal experiences of kind of balancing like what you want, like as like the creative person in charge of say the music, versus and like kind of balancing that with what the person paying you actually wants?
Hmm. Yeah.
I'm sure you have plenty of stories about this.
Yeah. I think film scoring is probably one of the biggest examples of that. Is like, um, you might have it in your mind what you think the best music is for this scene, uh, but you've been working with this music in your head for a long time, and it is actually like you hear it differently than anyone else who watches the film. Um, and so sometimes you just have to really listen to the director, and if they don't like it, there's probably a reason. And sometimes that reason is that they've been listening to the music with a temp track before your music,
Right.
and they have that stuck in their head. So that's another issue. And then you have to fight for your own stuff there. But most of the time, they're onto something, that the tone is off or whatever. And it's really hard because you invested the time in it. And
Right.
letting go of that is a skill too. But after a certain point, you just realize like, well, I've written so many melodies and whatever. Like if I drop this one and it never gets heard again, it's not the end of the world. And
Right.
that's really tough when you're starting out songwriting or composing. It's like everything is a precious gem, and it is. But that probably means that you're not ready for client work if you're holding on to the ideas.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, man. I have a fun. I had a funny thing happen to me a few years ago. I was just getting started doing like web design work. Like I like build websites for people a fair amount these days. And I remember I was talking to a friend of mine who she's a graphic designer for like a big agency in the area. And I was talking to her about like I remember I was saying to her, I was just like, gosh, like this person, like they don't know what they're. I was like, yeah, I was probably sounding like a complete idiot, but I was like, oh, like they don't know what they're talking about, like this, like I was like, they're like wrong with this, and she was like, dude, it's not about what you want, like it's not at all what it's like you have to basically like she basically told me, so Crystal, if you're watching this, thanks, this is great advice, but she was like she basically told me, she was like, listen, I mean, you have to be able to let go of what you think is right, because they don't care what you think. They're paying you to do a job for them. Like your job is to bring their vision to life. And
Hmm.
and like I was like, "Oh, you're right."
Yeah.
And I immediately shut up. But
Yeah.
yeah,
And it's
but
easy to get caught in the trap of like, well, I'm the music expert here, so
right.
why isn't my idea right?
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
you just
right.
have to get over that ego
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough thing. So, how does so like what are some of the examples of like common? I mean, are there like common kind of compromises or things that you have to make? Because I mean, I think anybody that's ever done anything with classical music, I mean, the first or or anything in the music world in general, that like they come from the perspective like so like, oh, I'm the expert here, so like I know what's right. So
Yeah.
like, are there any common compromises or things that you've kind of come across that you just kind of expect you'll have to deal with whenever you're doing this type of work? I mean, like, what are some things people could look out for if and when they're fortunate enough to start doing this kind of work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I I think, um, well, on the classical music side, uh, I interviewed someone who gave a good piece of advice that like sometimes you think that um, one specific way of writing the music is uh, the best way, and you can't change a note. But his advice was like, even if you change sometimes 10% of the music, that's really hard for players. Just make some compromises there, and the piece will be like that much more playable, that much more enjoyable. If people don't have to like spend hours learning a few measures.
Right.
So yeah, that on the classical side, that's a good thing to keep in mind. And um, on the on the film scoring side, uh, some compromises are like, well, I guess like with this past film that I worked on, it was a skydiving documentary, and I kind of had free reign to like do any style, all over the place, like electronic, rock, ambient, and for the most part, the music worked. But there's always like maybe one or two things in the mix that the producer was like, well, this flute reminds me of a Zelda flute. And I really liked the melody, but I realized that if he thinks it calls too much attention to itself, then other people are probably going to get distracted by it.
Right.
So, it's not that big of a deal for me to just take out that instrument, even though I thought it made the piece more complete. It made me rethink it, and it made me rework my mix to actually make a more interesting piece, I thought. So you just have to be willing to make your music slightly less interesting musically sometimes.
Sure. Well,
like you don't have to write a fugue for like a very simple score under dialogue or something like that.
Right. Yeah, well, that's an interesting point for folks, and just to kind of point out is that like it's almost not necessarily about. I mean, and this goes for anybody that ever plays an event, whether you're a live musician or, I mean, even like a DJ or something. I mean, or composing a score to a film. It's like it doesn't always have to be like, look how interesting I can be.
Mm-hmm.
It's like at that point, like. At like a point in, say, like a film where there's like a really like intimate bit of dialogue or something, like that is not the place to show off your like your chops for like writing fanfares or something. Like it's all like very contextual almost, and that's an interesting point, that it's like that it doesn't distract from what the purpose of that like larger thing is.
Mm-hmm. And usually you will have moments in a film where maybe there is no dialogue, and that at that point it's like they do want something more interesting. So that's kind of the compromise. In some parts you might just be playing a held chord, but other parts is where you can like show off your skills a little more.
Right. Totally. Cool. Well, man, that's so interesting. I could like pepper you with questions about that for like hours, but I'll hold myself back. So, Charlie, you've got coming up. We're kind of getting towards the home stretch here. I want to make sure that we get a chance to talk about your podcast and this big project you have coming up. So, first off, can you just tell us a little bit about, because we didn't really, we talked about you have a podcast, but first, can you tell us what your podcast is and like what kind of stuff you cover and the guests you have on? I mean, I was going through the guests and checking everything out before we got on, when I was just doing a little research on this. I mean, there's just like a fascinating slew of people in there. So can you just talk about some of like what the podcast actually is, and then what your project, what's coming up next with it?
Sure. Yeah. So the podcast is called Composer Quest, and
I'll link to all of this stuff on the show notes on the page on my site.
Cool. Yeah. So, like I said, it kind of started out with me interviewing my friends, mostly songwriters, and I just really enjoyed hearing all these different perspectives on the creative process of making music. Because, like, I don't know, composer interviews sometimes are a lot about just like, oh, where'd you grow up? Oh, what instrument did you play first?
Right, right,
And
right,
I kind
right.
of cut through that at first because it's like, I'm not going to ask my friends all this stuff because I mostly know it. So we just like dig deep into the stuff I'm actually interested in, which is like, how do you structure a song? Or, like how do you get a gig as a composer, that kind of
Right,
thing.
right.
Uh, but yeah, then I kind of branched out to talking to like film composers, video game composers, and music psychologists because like I'm really interested in that too. Um, and some of those episodes, I probably interviewed about 10 psychologists in the 150 so episodes, and those are some of my favorites because they really help you like think more creatively and that kind of thing. I interviewed Diana Deutsch, who was like an expert in musical illusions.
Huh.
Um, so I don't know. There's just a ton of different interviews, and I mean, personally, I never thought I would be a podcaster because
Right.
I wasn't like the best public speaker or anything, but it was kind of just like learning to listen and ask questions that will get people talking.
Right.
Um, so so anyways, yeah, that's the idea of the podcast. Um, and this year is actually my final year of the
Oh,
show. So
final year.
the world tour, I was like, I need to do something really exciting as the final season. I kind of go in 3-month seasons, and um, so I decided to do a world tour, going around the U.S. and Australia and Taiwan. I just kind of put a call out to my listeners, like, "Hey, do you have a place where I could stay, and I'll come hang out, interview you?" And a lot of people responded, so I'm really excited for that coming up this fall.
Right. So what all will the world tour entail? So I mean, obviously you're going to be traveling around. So are you like going to be interviewing people specific to like a region, like a city? I don't know, like Australia. Are you going to be like going to Sydney and like interviewing like composers that live in Sydney? And like, is that kind of the idea of it?
Yeah, I mean, my goal with the show, I do kind of go for talking to some famous people, but at the same time, I kind of just do this American life approach where it's like every pretty much every person, no matter how famous they are, has some interesting perspective on the art of composing. So I'm kind of I'm kind of just leaving it somewhat up in the air, like who I'll actually talk to in Australia and Taiwan and that kind of thing. Um, I mean, I have planned out a ton of interviews, but I kind of like the idea of exploring as I go on the tour and see who I meet. And then the other part of it too is like, since it's the final season, I want to do some kind of bookending. So a lot of people that I interviewed here in Minnesota during the first season have maybe moved on out to different parts of the country. So it's going to be kind of like a connect with them again and see what they've been up to for the past 4 years.
Yeah. Wow. That's
So
interesting. That'll probably be really fascinating.
yeah, and it's a much different format. Well, not super different, but you know, doing this world tour is going to be an interesting format to feel like to keep people feeling like they're kind of on the tour with me. So, I kind of want to release episodes as I go, and
Right.
I'm going to experiment with so a good friend of mine who's a filmmaker, not a musician, but we always have good creative talks. So
Right.
we're going to do like check-ins, so that each episode will like I'll chat with him about like what I've been doing on the tour, and he'll probably ask me some questions too. So it's not just like me saying, "Well, today I did this and this and this,"
Right.
but
Right.
more of a conversation. Um, So yeah, that's kind of the overarching goal, is to make it a journey for people to listen to.
Very
And
cool.
the other piece of my podcast is, like I mentioned, these composing quests where I give listeners challenges to get
Right,
involved.
right.
So my plan for that, for this final season, I wanted to do something big, but also like in small chunks that people can compete in. Uh, well, not compete, but participate in.
Right, right, right.
So my idea was to do Composer Quest Olympics, which would be like a series of Olympics themed composing challenges, like a relay race, for example, where one person starts a song and then the next person continues it on,
Oh,
and then the
that's
next person
interesting.
continues. Yeah. So I'm still working out the details, but if people are songwriters or composers and they want to get involved,
Yeah, there are definitely some
they'll,
that follow my stuff, so hopefully they check it out.
yeah. I'll have more info on my website, composerquest.com. But uh, yeah,
Very
I'm
cool.
excited for the trip, and um, yeah,
Yeah, that's exciting stuff, man. So before we go off air, where can people learn more? I mean, obviously the podcast, but like, I mean, where can people learn more about you? Where can they follow along with what you're up to? I mean, do
sure.
you have an email, like newsletter? You keep up with people? Like, where can people learn more?
Yeah, so if they want to be on my email list, it's um, I have a link on the right hand side of my page right now. Composerquest.com is easiest to find that,
Okay,
or charliemccarron.com. And I'm on Twitter with those handles too,
all right.
ComposerQuest and Charlie McCarron.
Very cool. Well, I
Yeah,
will link to all of that in the show notes. And before we do the final sign off, Charlie, is there any like kind of last message you want to leave with the listeners? Anything you want to, any last bit of wisdom, advice, thoughts, funny jokes, or anything?
uh, hmm. Well, um, I guess to bring it back to like your first steps and getting things, um, getting connected with people and stuff is kind of like take chances on things. I mean, I know it's better if you can get paid for gigs, obviously, but it's mostly just about taking chances, meeting people, even if it's online. If you're not a very social person, um, in person, there's a lot of ways to meet people online. Get involved with those kind of Facebook groups, and make connections that way. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's just the more people you get to meet and just know you personally, the more opportunities you'll have, guaranteed.
sage
So,
advice.
yep.
Very cool. Well, Charlie, thanks so much for taking the time to come on. I really appreciate having taken the time, and I look forward to sharing this with everybody and passing along. And good luck on your own composer quest around the world.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me, Seth.